Welcome. Good to see some different faces here. I think that's probably because of the baby dedication. That's great. Glad you're here. So, do you guys, you have a story. We all have a story. If you think about your story, is it a story of redemption, or is it more of a disaster story? I mean, aren't there seasons in life where, like, if you ask me in certain days, it's like, my story's a disaster story, right? Well, Naomi, her story, up to this point, in her mind, it's been a disaster story, right? And we have these little glimpses of hope, and maybe, as the text moves on, will it become a story of redemption? And we know it does. Spoiler alert. But here's the thinking. How do you know that God is at work in your story? In those dark seasons, the painful seasons, if you can't see God in your story, what does that mean? Does that mean he's forgotten or abandoned you? That's the question we're going to dig into today, okay? So what I've decided to title this thing today, actually, let me go back one. No, I think that is first. Yep, there we go. So I've showed this to you a while ago. Now, don't blurt it out. But what is that? Like, that's the question, and you don't have to know the answer. I showed this during Philippians a couple months ago. So, maybe it's a satellite image of the Ubrodsky region of Russia. I just made that up. And then what's that? Any clue? Okay, these are the things that we don't know about, right? And so what we're talking about today is the theological object permanence. Big title. Seeing the kindness of God in dark places. Now, object permanence is a thing. I didn't know about this. My wife, did you know my wife has a master's in counseling? I frequently say that's why we're still married. But anyway, it's only mostly a joke. So anyway, I came home one day, and she says, John, like our son Jesse was like, I don't know, 5 months old. She says, John, I think Jesse has object permanence. And I'm like, do we call the doctor? What does that mean? I don't know what you're talking about, right? And she's like, no, it's the thing where, like a little baby, if you show him a thing and you hide it, they still know it's a thing. Normally, little babies, like, a couple months old, if the thing disappears, they think the thing's gone, which explains why sometimes parents put the little baby to bed. They leave the room, and the kid freaks out. They're gone! And they start crying. It's only a couple months, and then they start to have object permanence. So today, we're learning, what does it mean when we can't see the kindness of God in the midst of our dark situations? Is he still there? The answer is yes. Should we close in prayer? No. Anyway, so that's where we're going. And I love to review, and so this is where we're at. We're here in the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth takes place during the period of Judges. So, the Bible starts with Genesis, and we have sin pretty quick in the story. The whole story of the Bible is redemption all the way to Revelation. You are here way down to the right. Jesus is the cross. And so this is how the Old Testament's laid out. We have the books of the law, books of history. This is the book of Ruth. Now remember, all these other books, poetry, major prophets, all of those books are over chronologically by the time you get to Nehemiah, Esther. So they're all shoved into that storyline. I just like to show you that now and then. And if you're visiting here, I mentioned this before. This is called a chiastic structure, very common with Hebrews people because they memorize large volumes of stuff. And so they like a pattern. It makes it easier to grasp. And also, the center of any chiastic structure is typically the heart of what's going on. For instance, Genesis 6, 7, 8 is one giant chiastic structure, okay? And the center of the whole flood narrative, God remembered Noah. And then it backs up. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is that the key to the book of Ruth is rest. The plan to find rest. Rest comes from God's loving kindness, from returning to the house of bread, and from following God in faithfulness. So that's kind of where we've been. And in this book, rest doesn't mean a nap. It doesn't mean taking a break from work. Rest, the Hebrew concept of rest that Ruth is about, is stability and security. Okay? You're safe. And if you're in this culture, you don't have a husband or sons, you're not safe, you're not stable, you're not secure, you don't have rest. So this is the thrust of what's going on here, okay? So The book of Ruth is about a story of during a famine where a particular family rejects God, rejects God's ways, and moves off to find life in Moab, and that results in death. And so that is captured here in the first verse. The first verse literally is just packed with stuff that the author assumes you're going to make all these connections, okay? For instance, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and the man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he, the man, and his wife and 2 sons. And so the very first verse, we're going back and going, okay, this story happens in the days when the judges ruled. Now, we are supposed to know about the days of the judges, and we're supposed to bring that context to this story. And if you don't know that, you're missing the point of the story. The context of Judges, the very last verse of the book of Judges, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. The period of Judges is marked by sin, anarchy, death, and destruction, and disobedience, and redemption. Okay? So, in the days when the judges ruled, there's a famine. Now, theologically, if this book happens in the days when the judges ruled and there's a famine, the famine is theological. It's not just, oh, the weather patterns have changed. No. And we took a look at Deuteronomy 28 that said, if you consistently disobey me, the heavens over your head shall be bronze, the earth under you shall be iron, the Lord will make the rain of your land powder, for dust will come down until you're destroyed. Because the gods in this culture were all fertility-based. They had to explain, where does the good stuff come from? Where does growth and flocks and herds and crops and sheep, and all that is money, all that is life to them. And so they gravitated towards these pagan gods of fertility, and God's like, oh, you think that's where the good stuff comes from? And he shuts off the rains and says, you look to me for rain, not for these gods. So anyway, that's what's going on there. And then it says in the days of the judges, he went to Moab. And that's just, if you're a Jew reading this, you're like shouting, no, you don't go to Moab looking for life, love, and fulfillment. Moab has just a track record of being a bad idea. And here's a picture of Moab. So this is Israel over on the left. This is Bethlehem, where a lot of this story takes place. And here's Moab over here. So it's as the crow flies, it's only 30 miles or so. So if there's a famine in Israel, there's a famine in Moab, right? It's just, anyway. Okay, so moving on here, we have this, look at this, I fixed it, the redemption cycle in Judges. And I challenge you, if you Google, not now because you'll get distracted, but if you Google Judges cycles and click on images, I mean 90%, 95% are going to say the sin cycles of Judges. And while that's true, it's also true that God's redemption happens there. So I like to call it the redemption cycle. Anyway, so there's a cycle of sin, foreign oppression, regret, deliverance. They have peace, and then they go through this 7 times, all right? And notice this says regret. It said repentance last week. But if you look at it, the word that's used in the text, it says they cried out to God because of their oppressors. They are not repenting. There's no turn of heart. The word means to shriek at terror or danger. So they're not like turning a new leaf and really sorry or any of that stuff. So we have those 7 cycles. This is the book of Judges. You have all these main judges here that we read about. Our story probably maybe happens during the time of Gideon. But why are there 7 cycles articulated? Probably the author is drawing your mind back to Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28, where he says, I will repay you 7-fold for your sins. And this is a story about sin and redemption, 7 of them, okay? So we got that. And then this is, again, that fertility concept. The Lord will make rain powder. And then in the very beginning, it said the Lord had visited his people. So the question we have to ask theologically is in chapter 1, verse 6, if the Lord is bringing back food and rain, if the reason there was no rain was theological, then to be consistent, the reason there is rain is theological, which means this is probably one of those cycles where they had regret and they cried out and the Lord re-engaged with them, okay? So that's what's going on there. And then chapter 1, now this is just chapter 1. The heart of chapter 1 is inability to conceive. So we have a problem with hunger and we have a problem with offspring. both of which are related to stability, security, and rest. So that's kind of where we're at. All right. And I guess I'll just park it there. All right, so, no, I'll go on. Okay. At the end of chapter 1, Naomi is the beginning of chapter 1. Pleasant, sweet. She's married. She has 2 sons. She has protection, security, support. At the end, she's bitter. She's widowed. 1 daughter-in-law. Defenseless, vulnerable, and no support. So we've got this trajectory here that's kind of a crisis in her life. And that sets the stage then for where we're going. Naomi, in chapter 1, in the span of 8 verses, 4 times told Ruth, go back to Moab. There's no future for you in Israel. There's no hope for you in Israel. God has abandoned me. God is against me. He's angry at me. He's fighting me. My life is a dumpster fire, and there's no hope for you. 4 times, go back to Moab, marry some Moabite guy, and maybe the Lord will bless you there, but he ain't blessing you across the river where I'm from. I'm living proof of that for a decade. So that's her story. And then we go to the ending of both chapters mentions something about barley harvest, and that's interesting. So here's how we get to the characters today, okay? This is men are squares, women are the circles, and so Elimelech and Naomi. Israel is on the left of the Dead Sea, the Jordan River. They have 2 kids, Mahlon and Chilion, and then they go to Moab, where Mahlon marries Ruth, Chilion marries Orpah, and then there's deaths. All the men die. It's interesting. It's not just starvation. The women don't die, just the men. Okay, that goes back to the responsibility men have in leading the family and choosing a pagan god when they should be choosing Yahweh. But anyway, Orpah, she just splits and goes back home. So we are now left with Naomi and Ruth. Those are the characters of the story, and that's where we are in Moab. Now we're ready for chapter 2. Okay, chapter 2, verse 1. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man. Interesting. Of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. So that whole Elimelech clan, there's some guy that's related, and he's a worthy man. Now we're supposed to pay attention to the narrator's description. If he's a worthy man, and his Boaz means in him is strength. Unlike Chilion and Mahlon, which means weak and pining. Names are significant, right? So this guy, he's worthy and he's strong. And I'm looking at Elimelech and comparing them. And so here's Elimelech who runs away from God, runs away from God's word, runs away from God's people, runs away from God's practices. And I'm asking, is Elimelech a worthy man? Yeah, no, not so much. Okay, so Boaz is standing above head and shoulders. Okay, so verse 2, Ruth the Moabite, and this book frequently pushes that. Don't forget Ruth the Moabite, the foreigner, the one who doesn't belong. Yeah, her. Okay. She said, let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him, in whose eyes I might find favor. Okay, a couple things here. I already mentioned that the context here is one of hunger and lack of offspring. If you don't have food, you die. If you don't have offspring, your line dies, okay? And as I mentioned last week, in narrative, historical narrative, it's not just history, okay? They don't just put down here stuff that happened. It's selected on purpose, like verse 1, full of clues that you are supposed to catch and go, aha, famine means theological disobedience, and bread and rain means they're coming back to God. Those things are part of how this story works in the days of Judges. Anyway, but another thing I said about historical narrative is that the first words often set the stage. And so here's what we observed last time. Naomi's first words were, go back to Moab. That's her heart. There's nothing for you in Israel. There's nothing for me in Israel. Go back. And so then Ruth's first words, no, I'm not going back to Moab. I'm staying with you. I'm picking you, your people, and your God. Right? Interesting. So those are the first words, and they set the stage here for what's going on. But what goes on here, in verse 2, she says, let me go and glean. And right there, we're like, okay, time out. I don't glean on the average day. So what's that about? Well, my wife and I went gleaning on our honeymoon we took a 5-month honeymoon. We packed our Jeep, bike, skis, rock climbing gear, and we literally traveled for 5 months, slept in fields, playgrounds. Police would kick us off playgrounds because it was free, and we just extended this. We didn't have a lot of money, but and gas wasn't like, $5 a gallon. Anyway, we drove all over Canada, and we went through Idaho after whatever machines they have pick up potatoes, but there's all these little tiny golf ball sized potatoes all over the fields. So we got a box, ran out in the fields and just filled this box full of potatoes, and we could eat like 2 or 3 days for free. So we just were like super budget oriented. We spent $120 on lodging in 5 months. Anyway, that's neither here nor there, but all I'm saying is gleaning means you're picking up free food, okay? That's what it is. And she says, let me go and glean after the one in whom I might find favor. So the way it worked is, I've got some pictures here. These are sheaves of wheat. So the harvesters would go out there, and they would have a little sickle, and they would cut it, and they kind of bundle up and stack it in piles and go around. And if you're gleaning, you had to wait until all of that work is done, and then they brought it from the field. And they would always drop some, you can imagine without modern equipment, you're just working with your hands, you're spilling and dropping. Maybe there's a stack of sheaves way back in the corner and you just forgot it. The Old Testament law said you cannot go back and get it. You cannot pick up what you dropped. It is for the poor people, okay? And so here's a couple verses from the Old Testament. When you reap your harvest, if you've forgotten a sheaf in the field, don't go back and get it. It's for the alien, the orphan, the widow, in order that God might bless you in the work of your hands. When you and it wasn't just wheat. If you beat the olive tree, don't do it twice, because the leftovers for the alien, the orphan, and the widow. When you gather grapes, don't go over it again. What's left is for the alien, the orphan, and the widow. And so you have this concept that farmers, let this sink in. Farmers would plant more than they needed and harvest less than they could for the sake of the poor. That would be like us taking out some money because we have a task to do, and we purposely take out more money from the ATM, planning to spend less because we're thinking someone I meet might have a need. You see what I'm saying? And it was just a little bit like that. So they planted more than they needed, harvested less than they needed. This is a threshing floor. They would take those bundles, they would put them on, it's about 40 feet across, beat it hard clay, and then they would actually drive around this. This is the only model I could find on the internet, but that you would have a couple oxen and a sledge, and the sledge had like spike things underneath it, and you would just throw all the sheaves down there, and they would get mashed and crumbled, and you drive in circles with this thing, and you grind everything to a pulp, and then you would take a pitchfork with narrow tangs, is that the word? And you would throw it up in the air, and all the evening was the best time to do this because the gentle breeze would blow away the light straw chaff stuff, and the heavy kernels would fall down to the ground. And so that's how they ended up with piles of grain during the harvest season. Now there's a threat of theft. So you got a pile of grain out in the middle of nowhere, so sometimes the owner would sleep by the pile of grain. If you know the story of Ruth, in chapter 3, Boaz is asleep by the pile of grain so that people don't steal it, okay? That's what's going on there, right? So they would separate the wheat from the chaff and protect the grain, and that's how that works. But my question is, how does Ruth even know about gleaning? I mean, Shamash has not made provision for Moabites to glean for the poor. You're just on your own over, and Shamash is the god of Moabites, okay? So this gleaning thing, I'm guessing Naomi must have told her a little bit about, our God, our ways, back in the good old days when God cared about his people, this would happen. But anyway, somehow Ruth knows about gleaning. But I mentioned this, I highlighted this when I read in that verse. Ruth was going to go after him in whom I might find favor. Because gleaning, it was in the law, but it was frequently discouraged or disallowed. Anyway, so the point is, if you're gleaning, you would have to just wait till all the workers are done, all the sheaves have been removed to the threshing floor, and then you could go in the field. And whatever you find is yours to keep, okay? So she has to wait and that's after that guy's done. And if she doesn't glean, she doesn't eat, and she dies. This is a serious, serious issue, okay? So favor is pretty important here. But gleaning is part of the law. It's the Old Testament law. Well, who wouldn't just leave money on the ground for the poor during the days of Judges when anarchy is prevailing? I'm sure everybody's doing this. Okay, sarcastic, anyway. Yeah, there are a lot of people that aren't doing this, and so that's why she's like, my entire plan to glean depends on me finding somebody who's righteous, who won't chase me off, won't rape or molest me. That's a real reality. If you're a foreign woman out wandering in the field looking for food, her entire plan depends on finding somebody of righteous character. And if you zoom way out, because we know Boaz is in the line of Jesus Christ and Ruth, if Ruth doesn't find someone in whom she finds favor, there is no Jesus Christ. There is no Messiah. This is a big deal. Now, I mean, God's not panicking, but I'm just saying that this is one of those moments where all of redemptive history comes down to one moment, one person's decision. And you're like, wow. And the backstory is that God is always involved in the backstory, right? And so he's got Boaz, and Boaz is a righteous man, and the next verse is great. Verse 3, so she set out and went out and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come. All of redemptive history. Now we have a collective sigh of relief. Oh, there's going to be a Messiah. Because she happened to come. Just lucky, I guess. Yeah, God's involved. Okay, anyway, God is always involved in the backstory. She happened to come to part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. Now, fields if you've been to Montana or some farms that are just gazillions of acres and it's just crazy implements with, wide, many rows of plows, those things. Anyway, okay, farms in this culture, first off, if you're of the clan of Elimelech, that means if Elimelech has 4 kids, whatever field he has to begin with, maybe at the most was 2 acres. That would be big. Now you have half an acre, because 2 divided by 4, right? I can do this. And so then those 4 kids have kids, and your little half an acre is now divided again. And whatever, as your family clan goes on, your field gets smaller and smaller and smaller. That's just the way it was. So the point is, whatever field this is, it's not huge, okay? You can probably walk across it pretty quickly. And she happened to come, but we know God is involved in the backstory. There's no just random luck. So here's the point. God is at work in the darkest moment of Naomi's story, but she doesn't always see it. She doesn't have theological object permanence, right? When she can't see it, she has concluded that that's not there. Verse 4, Boaz came from Bethlehem. Well, where did Elimelech leave? He left Bethlehem. Well, there's an interesting contrast. Now remember, Bethlehem, Beit is the Hebrew word for house. Lachem is bread, house of bread. So there's a famine in the house of bread, which itself is full of irony. And so Elimelech leaves the house of bread during the famine, but Boaz chose to stay in the house of bread during a famine. I'm backing up and concluding, when divine discipline happens, don't run away, right? Stay with God with what he's doing. When the pressure comes, stay with him, stay with his word, and don't run off across the boundary to seek fulfillment someplace else. All right, so verse 4, he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you," and they answered, "The Lord bless you." Now, to catch the full weight of that, you're going to have to quickly scan Judges and all the horrific murders and crazy, weird, perverted, super bad things that happen there. I'll just phrase it that way. And in the days when that's going on, you have this guy, a boss, who's like, "The Lord bless you." That just doesn't fit the days of Judges. Have you guys ever had a great boss? I mean, we could tell stories about the not-so-great bosses, but this is recorded, so I just kind of move right past that. But anyway, so we've all had good bosses and bad bosses, and Boaz is a good boss. He cares for his people. He's like, "The Lord bless you," right? And then look how they respond back. Yeah, the Lord bless you. So that is amazing. And again, remember dialogue. first words set the stage for what's going on. And so we'll go back here. Naomi's first words, go back to Moab. Ruth, I'm not going to Moab. I'm staying with you, your people, and your God. Now Boaz, his first words, the Lord be with you. So you've got this guy who's theologically dialed in, providing hope, and he's a righteous, worthy, strong character who is walking with God. And so, verse 5, Boaz said to his young man in charge of the reapers, whose woman is this? She's new. What's her story? And the servant who was in charge of the reapers said, well, she's the young Moabite woman that came back with Naomi and from the country of Moab. Now, this next verse is, it's difficult. The Hebrew is very difficult. And in fact, there's one commentator, he just ignores the last 14 words because there's really no consensus. But here's a translation, okay? Verse 7. She asked, may I follow the harvesters and gather grain among the bundles? So she came and has come and she has stood. This waiting area has been her dwelling. The house, shade, shelter means little. That's I think, as good as we can get there. The idea, she's not gleaning among the sheaves. Some translations say, Boaz doesn't let her do that until verse 15. So, and you have to wait until the reapers are done. You don't just jump into the barn and start with a shovel, right? Unless Boaz says so, but that comes later in verse 15. Anyway, so here's a picture of Ruth patiently waiting until everything's done and it's her time to go glean. So she's patiently waiting, and she had to stay behind the reapers. She had to wait. And then when it's her turn, she goes. But Boaz, in verse 8, look at what he says. Listen, my daughter, do not glean in any other field, or don't leave this one. Keep close to my young women. And when he calls her my daughter, he is elevating her up from the Moabite. And so her days of being called the foreign Moabite, they're over. My daughter. Like there's hope rising, right? Okay? There's rest on the horizon here. And then he goes on and says, keep close to my young women. That word keep close is the same word of when Ruth clung to Naomi. Same word. Ruth is keeping close to Naomi, and Boaz says, keep close to my young women. And then her days of wandering are over. In verse 9, this, again, in the days of Judges, to get the full impact. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, my field. Go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? Okay, it's not that he didn't want them to play tag. This is a word for inappropriate sexual touching. Molest. I've told my men not to molest you. Okay, thanks, I guess. That's creepy, weird, awkward. But in this culture, the days of Judges, if you're a foreign woman in some random field, you're fair game. Except not in Boaz's field. Boaz is like, okay, guys, she's off limits. All right? So he's protecting her. Her days of being the Moabite are over. Her days of wandering are over. And her days of being at risk for rape are over, as long as she stays close to this redemptive family. All right? And so, when he goes on in verse 9, when you're thirsty, just drink where the servants drink. She fell on her face, bowing, that's a word for worship, to the ground, said, why have I found favor in your sight? Why do you take notice of me? I'm just a foreigner. So she's shocked because of that cultural difference is so strong. What Boaz is doing is just off the charts, bizarre, random, weird, and has no explanation other than God's writing the backstory, and he's got an agenda here, okay? And so if you're having a hard time getting your head around that, think in terms of Jesus and the Samaritan woman, because you know how Samaritans, you just don't talk to a Samaritan. And Jesus is like, I'm going to talk to a Samaritan because I have a broader plan that you guys can't figure out. And so that cultural train wreck is right here with Boaz and Ruth the Moabite. And he's like, come on up. I'm elevating you. And all the workers would be like, did you hear what happened at work today? This would be a big deal, okay? It'd be all over. All right, anyway, verse 11. Boaz says, everything you've done for your mother-in-law, the death of your husband has been fully told to me. You left your father, your mother, native land, came to people you didn't know. And the phrase there literally says, it's been explained and re-explained to me. So you get the idea that Boaz has done his homework. He's like, now, who is this woman? Where'd she come from? Okay, tell me again. What was the story? Elimelech, what? And who is she? So he's like chasing down, it's not like internet stalking, but he's just trying to get answers like who she is and what's going on. And then he prays for her, and this prayer, this is a theological little Sunday school lesson. Boaz in verse 12, the Lord, Yahweh, repay you. Now just stop there. Boaz is saying Israel's God of Yahweh should repay the Moabite. Well, that's interesting. For what you have done, and a full reward given you by Yahweh the Lord, the God Elohim of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. So this repaying concept, in ancient Near East, all the gods were thought of in terms of repaying gods. So when Ruth hears Boaz say, yeah, Yahweh should repay you, she's like, yeah, okay, I'm familiar with that. Shamash repays with death if you do something bad. And so, but Yahweh, if I do something good, maybe I get something good. But it's different than that. He goes on, he says, Yahweh is the God Elohim of Israel. So Boaz is collapsing these categories and helping Ruth understand, yeah, this isn't just some random one of many gods. This is the God, and He is the one we worship, and He's the one you are finding refuge under His wings, okay? So Ruth is claiming to find security under the wings of Yahweh, but it's not left to be that vague. Boaz is personalizing and incarnating those wings. He's the one that is sharing that kindness with her. All right, and so what makes... So Ruth would initially think, okay, yeah, your God, my God, whatever, they repay, I get it. And Boaz is taking it further. No, our God is kind. He values the transformation of people. He values the outsider. He values rescuing those who have no hope and giving them hope and life. And that hope and life is with Him, in His land, with His word, following His ways, all of which Elimelech left. Verse 13, and so here we go. She said earlier, let me go find favor, and now look what she says. Verse 13, I have found favor in your eyes, to Boaz. You have comforted me, spoken kindly, even though I'm not one of your servants. So she found favor, and then he just starts to dump the truck in a good way. He's like in verse 14, come here, eat some bread, dip your morsel in the wine. Now that word come here means there's a distance that's involved. In other words, from over there far away, come nearer. So you get the picture that she has withdrawn herself appropriately for the culture. She's a Moabite. She doesn't belong at the dinner table, right? So she's, again, standing over there politely, waiting her turn. And Boaz is elevating her. Come here, come near, eat with us. So Boaz says, sit with the workers, eat with the workers. Boaz served her, which again, the workers' jaw would drop. Like, I don't know what's going on here, but it's a big deal. And then he gives her a lot of food. So in a couple hours, you and I will be eating lunch, presumably. Why do we do that? Because we're hungry. Yeah, that's not why they eat here. Okay, here in this culture, mealtime... sometimes they are just hungry, but very frequently mealtime it's a thing of hospitality, it's social engagement, contracts. Think if you buy a house, how weird it would be if you have this big, fancy lunch celebration for the contract. That's kind of the culture here, okay? Just that they do things in that culture. So social things, religious things, and also just to celebrate. But the point here, this mealtime, when Boaz elevates her and serves her, this is a picture of God's kindness, His graciousness, and His abundance. You want abundance? You stay with Yahweh. You stay with Israel's God, okay? And so verse 15, she rose to glean, and again, Boaz says, don't reproach her and don't rebuke her. Don't molest her, don't reproach her, don't rebuke her. He's protecting her physically, protecting her psychologically. Don't shame her, don't make fun of her. And then in verse 17, she gathers an entire ephah of barley. Doesn't that just blow your mind? Yeah, an ephah is 30 to 50 pounds, depending on the quality of grain, okay? So a while ago, we bought a big sack of grass seed, is 30 pounds, and that's a pretty big thing. Imagine Ruth coming back with 30 to 40 pounds for you weightlifters, one plate, 45 pounds. That just put that in a bag, and you get Ruth walking around. But that's a lot of weight. And so no wonder she shows up at home, and Naomi is like, what is going on? Where did you get all that? That's the sense here in verse 19. Her mother-in-law said, where did you glean? Where have you worked? And she says, blessed be the man who took notice of you, because that ain't normal. Okay, whatever you got there, that's not normal. So somebody's special. They got their eye on you. And she goes on, well, the man's name was Boaz. And now here's where things come together for Naomi. Naomi said, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. Let me help you out with that. Up to this point, Naomi has thought that the Lord's kindness had left her. She was abandoned, forsaken, and God was against her. But all of a sudden, she started to see hope of rest and security. The living, it would be Ruth and Naomi. The dead, Elimelech, Mahlon, and Chilion. So what she's saying here is that God has not abandoned our family, even though there are dead members of our family. Let that sink in, right? God has not abandoned our family, even though some have died. Interesting, right? And so this kindness, this word kindness here, the Lord whose kindness, it shows up frequently here. It's the Old Testament word hesed, and it's super deep and super complex. There's no one word that captures it. It means love, mercy, grace, kindness, faithfully, goodness, benevolence, loyalty, and covenant faithfulness, all wrapped up. It's a thick, deep, powerful word. And she's like, yeah, Yahweh hasn't quit. He hasn't forsaken us. All right? He's working in the background, and she's starting to see it. But God was working in the background even before she could see it. See that? So she's starting to have theological object permanence, right? She's starting to go, God is at work in the background. Even though there are dead people in my family, bad things have happened, God is not forsaken his kindness. If you and I can figure that out and sort of ingrain that in our weekly rhythms, it would change our life, right? Total turnaround, right? So she's turning around. So there's hope here when she says he's one of our redeemers. Let me unpack that for you. Culturally, if there's a husband and wife and there's no kids and the husband dies, the woman is just completely destitute and on her own, and that line, that family line, could just disappear. So the law provided that the nearest brother of the dead husband unmarried brother, would marry her, and the offspring would be in the brother's name. The guy who's doing that, he doesn't get his line going until later, but he would have to pour money and time and have this family. And okay, now you're my brother's family name, and then later on he would work on his own family line, and that would take sacrifice and character, which is why you don't see it during the days of the judges. So this is unusual. And so this concept comes up, and again, there's the sun's rising. Maybe there's hope. Maybe this is what's going to go on. And then Ruth says, he said, you should stay with me until all my harvest is done, in verse 21. And then Naomi, you get a picture of the days of Judges. Naomi said to Ruth, it's good that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted. See, that's a very real possibility. So stay with this guy. He seems to protect you. And so that's good. She's clinging to Boaz, his young women, his young men, and being protected there, okay? So the story ends with a glimmer of hope. Look at, verse 23. She kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat. That went into July, so you've got April, like 6 or 7 weeks. That's enough time for things to develop interpersonally. Although at this point you get the sense that Ruth, she's not looking at Boaz as any kind of romantic interest. She's just like a foreigner, lucky to be there, right? And she has no clue about this whole kinsman redeemer, whoever married this person. That she's like, I'm just trying to get grain. So there's hope down the road here. Both chapters end with harvest. There's famine, and both chapters end with the harvest. So there's hope coming in here. So we back away from that and we just ask again, is your story a story of redemption or is it a disaster story? And really, they can both be true. It depends on the lens that you look at it with. If you look at the short-term lens and you don't factor in God, you're like, well, this is a disaster. But if you zoom out and you understand, God's kindness is still present even when I cannot see it. And that is a walk of faith. Because there are many times we cannot see it. But just because we can't see God's kindness, does that mean he has forsaken us? No. He is always working on the backstory. She was 10 years in the backstory. And I know some of you have been longer than that with a backstory. And they can be painful. So, sometimes we're spectators in our own dark stories. Something just happens to us, a storm hits and blows everything up, and it's just, been there, tears, and never forget my wife hauling out soggy insulation from one of our rental houses after a storm, and she's just sobbing. It's just like, we didn't do anything wrong, but other times, I have been a participant in my own dark story, right? God visits me in a special way of discipline. John, that's the boundary. You knew it. Stitches, told you that story. So it's like, I get that. Okay, message received. Anytime I get stitches, I'm pretty alert. Anyway, so, but all stitches aren't disciplinary. That's the thing. You got to figure that out. Anyway, so let's go back to this, okay? What is that? Anyone remember? It is not a satellite image of a river. It is a glass. And what about this one? What's that? No clue. What about that? Oh. Okay. Now, here we go. Anyone? 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 This is a clue. Anyone? Anyone? Yes, Ferris Bueller. Everything I know about art comes from Ferris Bueller. So that this is the movie in Ferris Bueller where he's looking at the girl and he zooms in. Anyway, so, okay. All I'm saying is that sometimes if you're so close to something, you can't see the big picture. That's why we say, I can't see the forest because of the trees. I'm down here by the trees. Which way is up? Where are we going? All right? So when we're so close to our own dark story, it is difficult to see God's big plan, and many times we don't see that. And we respond by faithfully walking with him in love. And so we want to stay with him in times of difficulty. We see the kindness of God in dark places by faith. And so, no matter where you are in the process of discovering God's loving kindness, he is always faithful. He's always kind. And he's always at work in our story. We just may not see it. So here is the key question as we close. Do you have room to return to God and regain his perspective of his redemptive work in your story? It's a life changer, but it won't necessarily change your circumstance, but it will definitely change your perspective of your circumstance. See what I'm saying? And so, by faith, we walk with God in the middle of pain and disappointment, and actually joy and contentment and peace are possible in the midst of loss and disappointment. So, I'm going to pray, and then we'll have a brief time in our church. We like to just take a couple seconds to think, because that's kind of like a rare thing in our culture, because everything's beeping all the time. And so we'll do that, and then we'll move into what's next. But let me just close with this. Now to him who is able to do far more abundantly than all that we ask or think, according to the power at work within us, to him be the glory in the church and even in Christ Jesus throughout all generations, forever and ever. Amen.